Greetings, my name is Jordan Barnes, and I am a graduating senior at Norfolk State University in Norfolk, Virginia. As a graduating senior, I have finally identified my academic interests as I matriculate into graduate studies. My academic interests fall into the legal academia realm, the history realm, all under the umbrella of African American studies. Currently, this research project is my senior project within the history department as I am enrolled in the history course entitled Black Leadership under the direction and tutelage of Dr. Lenoyce. This course aims to help students identify and examine Black leadership from the beginning of American society to modern and contemporary times. My research project examines the Black leadership of the NAACP legal department, which shifted into a separate organization and entity, the Legal Defense Fund. As I examine the Black leadership within the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, I'm utilizing the theory entitled the critical race theory. This is a theoretical framework in the social sciences that examines society and culture as they relate to categorizations of race, law, and power. This theory was developed in the 1970s by Derek Bell and others such as Alan Freeman and Richard Delgado, in which they combine critical legal studies and radical feminism to develop a theoretical framework that challenges the way that race and racial power are constructed by law and culture. This theory combines progressive political struggles for racial justice with critiques of the conventional legal and scholarly norms which are themselves viewed as a part of illegitimate hierarchies. Within this critical race theory, there are several tenets that are implemented and are examined during the application. With the application process, critical race theory includes several tenets such as racism is ordinary and not aberrational, entrance convergence, social construction of race, storytelling versus counter-storytelling, intersectionality, and whiteness as property. Thurgood Marshall was an influential leader of the civil rights movement. He has also had a profound contribution to the NAACP, and his legacy lives on in the pursuit of racial justice. Thurgood Marshall founded the Legal Defense Fund in 1940 and served as its first director counsel. He was the architect of the legal strategy that ended the country's official policy of segregation. Marshall later became the first African American to serve on the Supreme Court, on which he served as an associate justice from 1967 to 1991, after he was successfully nominated by President Lyndon B. Johnson. Under the tutelage of Charles Hamilton Houston, Thurgood Marshall grew into a prominent figure within the civil rights movement as he developed a following amongst various African Americans, especially those who believed in progressive politics and progressivism amongst the American society. Thurgood Marshall's popularity grew significantly after his passionate fight for racial justice within the educational institutions, as he served amongst the civil legal team within the case of Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, in which he helped ended the public segregation of African American students within the separate but equal doctrine. After founding the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in 1940, Marshall became the key strategist in the effort to end racial segregation and implement racial equality. In 1957, the Legal Defense Fund, led by Marshall, became an entirely separate entity from the NAACP with its own leadership and board of directors. With this accomplishment, Marshall therefore engaged in organization building and institutional building, as Marshall created a separate entity for civil rights legal attorneys and litigators to engage in the racial quest for justice and equality amongst the African American people and people of African descent. As a lead legal architect of the civil rights movement, Marshall constantly traveled throughout the South, at one point overseeing as many as 450 simultaneous cases, as he challenged the framework of white supremacy throughout the American society. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court declared the doctrine of separate but equal unconstitutional, handing the Legal Defense Fund their most celebrated victory in its storied history. The Supreme Court decision in Brown was ultimately unanimous. After a hard-fought multi-year campaign by the Legal Defense Fund counsel team to persuade all non-justices to overturn the separate but equal doctrine that their predecessors had endorsed in the court's infamous 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson decision. This campaign was headed by Charles Hamilton Houston within the 1930s and later by his student Thurgood Marshall for the next 2 decades, who later became the Legal Defense Fund's first director counsel. Utilizing critical race theory, Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston fought against several tenets within critical race theory, such as social construction of race, whiteness as property, and storytelling versus counter-storytelling. In 1971, the Supreme Court heard the legal argument of Griggs versus Duke Power in their legal case. In Griggs, the Legal Defense Fund represented a group of 13 African-American employees who worked on the Duke Power Company's Dan River Steam Station. Duke Power had a long history of segregating employees by race. At the steam station, the best jobs were reserved only for whites. African Americans were relegated to the labor department, where the highest paid worker earned less than the lowest paid worker, and the other 4 departments where only whites worked. Shortly after Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it made it illegal for employers to discriminate on the basis of race. However, Duke Power implemented new standards for hiring and promotions that negatively impacted African American workers. These new requirements were not an improvement, however, they effectively perpetuated the discriminatory policies that Duke Power had utilized prior to the enactment of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. As a result of the Legal Defense Fund's advocacy, the Supreme Court embraced a powerful legal tool now known as the Disparate Impact Framework that has proved essential in the fight to eradicate arbitrary and artificial barriers to equal employment opportunities for all individuals regardless of their race. Utilizing critical race theory, this new framework addresses the social construction of race, intersectionality, and whiteness as property. Thurgood Marshall rose in the front of the United States Supreme Court to argue that Texas' Democratic primary system allowed whites to structurally dominate the politics of the one-party South. Specifically, the case of Smith versus Alt-Right presented the question of whether the Texas Democratic Party's policy of prohibiting blacks from voting in the primary elections violated the 14th and 15th Amendments. The Supreme Court held that the United States is a constitutional democracy and that it ruled that Smith overruled a unanimous 9-year-old decision in Grovey versus Townsend that held that the Texas Democratic Party race-based restrictions on voting in primaries was constitutional because it was not a state action and thus it had not been endorsed or authorized by the state. This ruling signaled the beginning of the Second Reconstruction and the modern civil rights movement. The political and social advances of blacks simply could not have occurred without the changes that came in the wake of the overthrow of the Democratic white primary. Marshall characterized the ruling of Smith, which he considered his most important case. African American voter registration vastly improved immediately following the court's ruling in Smith, causing Marshall to recognize the case as a giant milestone in the progress of Negro Americans towards full citizenship. As stated in the beginning, critical race theory serves as a theory that combines progressive political struggles for racial justice along with critiques of the conventional legal and scholarly norms which are themselves viewed as part of a legitimate hierarchy. With this in mind, Thurgood Marshall showcased his black leadership as he gained a following of African Americans who believed in this progressive political struggle for racial justice, as well as his critique of the legal norms that perpetuated illegitimate hierarchies, specifically white domination over the American society. Thurgood Marshall serves as a person that can gain a following and also believed in organization building as he first founded the Legal Defense Fund, turning it into a separate entity later in his legal career. I find Thurgood Marshall's methods of activism the most effective as he challenges and confronts the legal frameworks of white supremacy within the American society. With the overruling of these white supremacists and white domination pieces of policy and legislation, it's easy for the other races to overcome and progress within the American society as they now find the means to challenge and confront the legal ramifications of white supremacy and their political voices.